When my Colonel Daniel Brooks called me into his office on a Tuesday morning, his voice was shaking over the intercom. I immediately assumed I was in deep trouble, or worse, about to be discharged. But when I pushed open that heavy oak door, my colonel wasn't even behind his desk. Instead, he was standing at rigid attention, sweat sweeping down his temple. Sitting comfortably in his leather chair was an older gentleman in a pristine dress uniform. I didn't recognize his face at first, but my eyes instantly locked onto his shoulders. Four gleaming silver stars. A General Richard Hayes. As I stood there frozen, the general looked up, smiled warmly, and said, "Hello again, Emma. I told you we'd meet under better circumstances." My mind raced back to that rainy night 2 weeks earlier. A desperate post asking for a rare blood type and a quiet stranger I chose to save. My name is Emma, and at 35 years old, my life was defined by the strict, predictable rhythms of military logistics. For years, I had worked behind the scenes on the base, managing supply chains, tracking inventory, and ensuring that everything moved precisely when and where it was supposed to. It was a demanding, exhausting job that rarely came with any public recognition, but I took a quiet pride in doing my duty well. Most evenings, I would return to my modest off-base apartment completely drained, wanting nothing more than to kick off my boots, heat up a simple dinner, and disappear into the mindless comfort of scrolling through my phone before falling asleep. It was on one of those completely ordinary, exhausting Tuesday evenings that everything changed. I was sitting on my sofa, half asleep, when an urgent notification popped up on a local community emergency board. Its snorts wasn't a standard update. It was a frantic anonymous post from the nearby Metropolitan Hospital, practically begging for immediate help. A patient had been admitted in critical condition following a sudden medical crisis, and the hospital's blood bank was completely depleted of O-negative blood, the rare universal donor type. My eyes locked onto the screen as I read the words, "Life-threatening emergency." Minutes matter. A cold shiver ran down my spine because I knew without a doubt that my veins held exactly what they were looking for. Before we go any further, I have to ask you, do you know your own blood type? And would you step up for a stranger? The exhaustion that had weighed heavily on my eyelids just moments before instantly vanished, replaced by a sudden, intense rush of adrenaline. I couldn't just sit here on my couch and ignore a literal matter of life and death, especially when I possessed the exact key to saving them. I stood up, grabbed my keys, and rushed out the door, completely bypassing the comfort of my warm apartment. Outside, the sky had completely broken open into a vicious, unforgiving storm. But I didn't care. I jumped straight into my car and carefully drove through a torrential downpour, the windshield wipers struggling to clear the heavy sheets of water blinding my view of the road. The drive to the hospital felt agonizingly long, each red light stretching my anxiety to the absolute limit. When I finally parked and sprinted through the sliding glass doors of the emergency donation wing, the atmosphere inside was thick with an undeniable, palpable tension. Snorts, it was complete chaos. Doctors and nurses were whispering urgently in tight circles, their faces drawn with deep worry as security personnel stood guard near the elevators. I approached the front desk, soaking wet and catching my breath, and told the Olivia Carter I was there to donate O-negative blood in response to the frantic online alert. Her eyes widened with immense relief, and without making me fill out the usual mountain of standard paperwork, she immediately grabbed my arm and guided me past the security lines into the main drawing room. The nurse quickly guided me to a vinyl recliner, prepped my arm, and smoothly inserted the IV line to begin the donation process. As the dark red fluid began to flow into the collection bag, the heavy tension in my chest started to ease slightly. Just a moment later, the curtain rustled and an older man was ushered into the chair right next to mine. His snorts looked utterly exhausted, his shoulders slumped and his face pale, as if he were carrying the crushing weight of the entire world on his back. He was wearing a faded, ordinary civilian jacket, and his eyes bore the deep, quiet strain of someone who had been awake for days fighting a losing battle. To pass the long minutes and distract ourselves from the steady hum of the medical machines, we struck up a quiet, comforting conversation. He spoke softly with a calm, but commanding undertone that immediately caught my attention despite his obvious fatigue. He looked at me with immense gratitude and thanked me profoundly for coming out in the middle of such a terrible storm on a moment's notice. Before the medical staff called him back toward the restricted upper floors, he leaned over and gently asked for my full name and my specific base assignment. I gave them to him without thinking twice, assuming he was just a worried relative of the patient. He smiled warmly, thanked me one last time, and softly slipped away into the busy hallway, leaving me alone with my thoughts. 2 full weeks passed after that chaotic, rainy night at the hospital, and life on the base quickly returned to its usual, demanding routine. I completely forgot about the strange encounter in the donor room, assuming that my blood had simply gone to an anonymous civilian patient who was now safely recovering somewhere out there. I went back to my long hours, tracking shipments and organizing cargo, completely unaware that a massive storm was quietly brewing right above my head. It was right in the middle of a hectic morning shift that the illusion of my normal, predictable routine was permanently shattered. Out of nowhere, my Captain Michael Turner stormed into my logistics workstation, his face completely pale and his hands visibly shaking as he held an official document. He didn't say a single word at first. He just stared at me with an expression of pure dread that immediately made my stomach drop into a frozen knot of anxiety. He handed me an urgent high-level directive bearing a dark red seal, ordering me to report to the Colonel Daniel Brooks's office without a single moment of delay. My mind instantly began to race through every worst-case scenario imaginable as I walked down the long, sterile hallways toward the administrative wing. Rumors had been aggressively flying around the base all morning that a massive, unannounced operational audit was suddenly taking place, and a wave of terror washed over me that I was somehow being set up as the convenient scapegoat for a major systemic error I didn't commit. By the time I reached the heavy oak door of the colonel's office, my breath was shallow. My heart was hammering violently against my ribs, and I was entirely convinced that my military career was about to come to a devastating, unfair end. I stood before the heavy oak door for a terrifying second, took a deep breath, and knocked. When my Colonel Daniel Brooks told me to enter, his voice sounded completely different than usual. It was tight, strained, and lacked its typical booming authority. I pushed the door open, fully bracing myself for a severe reprimand, but the scene inside immediately froze me in my tracks. My colonel wasn't even sitting behind his massive desk. Instead, he was standing rigidly at attention against the wall, sweat actively sweeping down his temple as he stared straight ahead into the room. Sitting comfortably in the colonel's high-backed leather chair was the older gentleman from the hospital. I gasped as my eyes instantly dropped from his familiar face to his shoulders, completely ignoring the rows of colorful medals pinned to his chest. There, catching the bright fluorescent light of the office, were 4 gleaming silver stars, a General Richard Hayes. The faded civilian jacket was gone, replaced by a pristine dress uniform that commanded absolute authority. As I stood there completely paralyzed, trying to reconcile the powerful figure before me with the fragile stranger I had comforted in the clinic, the general looked up at me and smiled warmly. "Hello again, Emma," he said, his voice carrying a deep, reassuring calm that instantly shattered the tense silence of the room. "I told you we would meet again under much better circumstances than a rainy emergency room." He snorts gestured for me to stand at ease while my colonel remained frozen like a statue beside us. The general explained that he had kept his identity completely hidden at the hospital for strict security reasons, as he was undergoing a highly classified medical procedure that could not be leaked to the public. But a man in his position never forgets a debt, especially one that saved his life. He opened a thick manila folder on the desk, and his warm expression instantly turned to cold steel. As he looked up at my colonel, the general revealed that his sudden visit wasn't an operational audit at all. He had personally initiated a deep dive investigation into our base's administrative records because of me. With absolute authority, he exposed a small group of corrupt high-ranking officers on my base who had been quietly sabotaging my career, blocking my earned promotions, and skimming military logistics funds for themselves. They had assumed a quiet specialist like me would never have the power to fight back against their system, but they were wrong. Right there in that office, the general completely dismantled their entire corrupt operation on the spot, ordering my colonel to strip them of their duties immediately. He then looked back at me, smiled, and handed me a newly signed directive that fast-tracked my well-deserved, long-overdue promotion to Chief Logistics Officer. Effective. Immediately walking out of the colonel's office that afternoon, my new rank insignia heavy in my hand, I felt like a completely different person. I realized how a single selfless act of kindness, driven by nothing more than a desire to help someone in need, had completely transformed my career, my standing, and my entire perspective on life. The corrupt officers who tried to bury my hard work were gone, and my future on the base was finally bright and secure. It just goes to show that you never truly know the impact a small good deed can have on the world around you, or how destiny might choose to reward a bleeding heart. If you saw an anonymous post begging for help in the middle of a brutal storm, would you drive through it to save a complete stranger? Comment below with your thoughts and the city you are watching from so I can see exactly how far Emma's story has traveled today. If you loved this journey, make sure to check out the 2 other incredible stories appearing on your screen right now and subscribe our channel Heartstone Lane. Thank you for watching.